All right. Well, joining me right now is current Senator-elect Sarah Anthony, who will be joining the Senate on January 1st officially. She's also a state representative at the moment. Uh, Representative, would you please be so kind as to say and spell your first and last name and acknowledge that you know that this is being recorded and that your constituents may be able to see it online?
Awesome. My name is Sarah Anthony, spelled SarahAnthony. And I do understand that I am being recorded and cannot wait for our constituents to see.
Excellent. Fantastic. So sort of the first question is, you're going into a Senate that for the first time in a long time has a Senate majority. Now it's a very narrow majority. It's a two-person majority. But how does that change your calculation? Because when you were running for Senate, there was a lot of question as to whether or not Democrats could flip the Senate the way they did. So we'll just start with that first impression of, oh my goodness, we're in the majority.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, we're in the majority. I've been at Michigan politics for quite some time, and I understand that the pendulum swings in terms of power. And I got my start in State Representative Joan Bauer's office around 2007, in which the Democrats had the majority in the House. And so I was able to understand what it meant to have at least a Democratic governor and one chamber in Democratic control. We were able to not just speak out against hateful, destructive, anti-progressive policies. We were also able to push policies that impacted working families. I saw that working in Rep. Bauer's office. And so having not only the Senate, but the House in Democratic hands, I think really gives us an opportunity to not just speak about our values, but also live them and ensure that we are advocating for people who need us the most. So I'm really excited about it. And I think that people across Michigan have pretty high expectations. And so I think that we have to not only be there and have the Democratic control, but also deliver for people.
Well, and as we talk about deliver for people, look, you've got 2 years of control of the legislature, which
Sure.
could change in 2 years, right? I mean, it's another election for House. What are you hoping will be sort of the major priorities that get changed or adopted in this first year of the 2-year legislative control process?
So I think that Michigan residents spoke out pretty loud and clear that they weren't interested in a lot of the hateful social issues that the Republicans were touting. A lot of the divisive policies that we've seen over the last few years under Republican control, I think that people said enough, that they were tired of Donald Trump, they were tired of 2020 politics, and they wanted something and people that spoke to the issues that mattered to them. So I hope that Democrats um, take the agenda that they heard on the campaign trail, that people wanted, to feel safe in their communities. They wanted their children to feel safe in school. They wanted relief. I mean, my goodness, every time I go to the grocery store, I'm shocked that even just carrying out 2 bags, I'm almost spending $100. Um, think about folks who are on fixed incomes, people who are in between houses. I mean, you can't walk downtown without seeing our homeless crisis. And so I think that people want us to prioritize what matters to working families and people who don't have, hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay fancy lobby firms. They want us to prioritize what matters to real people. So those are sometimes called kitchen table issues. But I think that when people wake up, they want to make sure that they are able to provide for their families and not have to pay, exorbitant amounts for this essentials, the basic needs. So the least we can do is give people a little bit of relief.
Okay. So you have been announced as chair of the Appropriations Committee for the Senate. which is a very powerful committee and a very powerful position to be in. Some of the things that the governor has talked about as sort of her priority rolling into the year is the restoration of the earned income tax. Excuse me for 1 second. I don't know which phone this is. Sorry about that. Is the restoration of the earned income tax credit and also elimination of the pension tax. Where are you at on that? And I'm going to throw a third thing in there, and it's something that I wrote about this last week, and it's we've sort of lost that charitable contribution deduction both on a federal and state level. Are you willing to lead the charge to reinstall some of the tax credits for charitable giving in Michigan, which right now don't exist? So that's three separate budget issues there.
Yeah. So I think the short answer with all three of those is absolutely, right? In concept, again, people need relief. And we have created under Republican control some pretty unfair structures and systems that have really been designed to keep, middle class folks, working class folks, folks who just are trying to make ends meet are being left behind. And so I think it's just going to be about where the numbers stand, right? We have to make sure that we're providing relief for men and women in our state, but also doing so in a fiscally responsible way. So we have to dig into the numbers. We obviously have an influx of federal money, but a lot of those are one-time investments. And so we have to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars in this state. So I think that, partnering with the governor, we can find some solutions that do give relief without leaving us in the next 4, 5, 10 years with some pretty significant budget holes. So we're just going to have to look at the numbers.
So within that construct of budget holes, as you know, we have tragically underfunded roads for decades. This is not, it was not a new problem. It was not Governor Whitmer's problem. It was something she inherited. And frankly, it wasn't necessarily Governor Snyder's problem either. He inherited it as well from the Granholm administration. We have had to cut back because we got hit early and hard with the housing bubble crisis before anybody else did, and we suffered a longer period for it. So how do we find the money to invest in fixing the roads? I mean, I go out onto Cedar Street and I'm dodging potholes. I'm sure you're dodging potholes through your neighborhood and around the city. So how do we find ways to finance the roads? Because that's a big question for most people.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting, Todd, because this was not one of the number one things that I heard on the campaign trail, and not only in mid-Michigan, but across the state when we were campaigning for other candidates, and which is different than what we heard in 2018 and 2020. That was really at the top of everyone's mind was roads. Right. Now what I've heard is yes, roads, but there's almost been this reality check that we've disinvested in roads, and we obviously are seeing some pretty significant structural issues because of that. But when I heard from people, it was housing, number one issue. It was quality education. The fact that if we have to decide, which I'm not saying we do, but folks were more interested in investing in quality education than in investing in the pothole around the corner, which in the back of their mind, they're thinking you can fill it right now, and next year we're going to have to fill it again. Right. And so, but you can't unfill the mind of a child. And so I think that maybe it's because of mid-Michigan and many of our constituents are hyper connected to these issues. They're very much aware. They read City Pulse. They are very attuned to the issues that are facing our community. But roads has not been the top priority. But that's not to say we don't need to really look at how we're funding our roads. I just think that from what I heard on the campaign trail, it was no longer the number one issue.
Which is interesting because the roads haven't gotten that much better since 4 years ago. So within that concept of education, we've also funded education as well for many years. that we finally had a really significant investment in this last budget. Do you expect to see continued increased funding for schools? And is it, this is sort of a philosophical question, but look, K-12, the K-12 system was designed for really preparing people for factory work, like being on the line and that sort of stuff. We're changing as an economy. Do we
Mhm.
need to reimagine how we create and deliver education in that same vein? And how do we fund that reimagination, if so?
Yeah, yeah. So I do think we need to reimagine. If you talk to our young people, right, which I spend a lot of time in the schools across mid Michigan, from our smallest residents and over at the community college, we have one underfunded education for such a long time, and it is inherently inequitable. If you just drive around mid Michigan, Ingham, Eaton, and Clinton County, you see some high school buildings that look close to prisons, and you see some that look like small community colleges. That is fundamentally criminal. We have said to our students that you're not worth it, that you're not worth the best, and that some students, based on their zip code or their family's income, deserves the right to more opportunities. So until we actually fix that, we will continue to have too many communities lagging behind. And so some of that is budget, some of that is policy. And those are some tough conversations that under Democratic control, we need to start having in earnest. And it's not just the buildings, but it's also how we are investing in teachers and incentivizing them to stay in the profession. Given, I was in one of the Lansing schools a couple months ago, and a 20-year teacher, she just was weary when I visited her classroom. There was a bullet hole in her window that had not been fixed for months and months. The conditions in the classroom were much too hot, and obviously we have invested with bonds and millages. But why is that always at the expense of local communities? What role does the state play in ensuring that every single kid from the UP to Detroit to here in mid Michigan receives not just substandard education and facilities, but the best? So until we actually figure that out, we're going to continue to see these large gaps. And, I come from the education space and always have to approach every single bill, every policy, every nickel with an equity lens. And for too long, we just haven't looked through that lens when we're deciding who gets what.
Well, within that construct of the equity lens, the legislature, and I think you helped shepherd this through, uh, made an investment to develop an inpatient psychiatric facility for teenagers at McLaren. We can't seem to get an answer as to where they're at on the planning for that, but that I'll keep digging. But the question for you is, look, COVID really highlighted for many people a lot of structural and systemic disadvantages that existed. And mental health is just one of those. But I think that was exacerbated by the 2 years or so of sort of social isolation. How do we bring that back together and bring people back together while recognizing these inequities? I mean, obviously they have to be addressed, but as a policymaker, you also have some responsibility in setting the policies to bring people together to help address the mental health crisis that's impacting our youth. So where are we at with that? Where are you at with that? And how are we going to get there?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Of course it is.
I was so proud to partner with Senator Hertel on reimagining what that McLaren site would look like. I'm a South Sider through and through, and the last thing we need is blight. And what we do need is services and industry and economic development and a heart to meet the needs of people, not just in South Lansing, but across the region. I cannot tell you, Todd, how many individuals, mostly parents, reach out to our office helpless because we do not have the services to ensure that their young people who have behavioral health issues can receive treatment, can find a place to go for help. We just have not done that. Our federal champion is Debbie Stabenow, who has for years been, championing this issue. We just have not gotten there as a state and as a nation. So that's another thing that's going to require not only money, but also sound policy to reimagine this entire community health system. But going back to that equity lens, one thing I'm super excited about is, you remember in 2020 when everyone was, declaring racism as a public health crisis, and
Right.
everyone had these big commitments to close gaps amongst racial groups, and that because of a legacy of oppression and racism and sexism, all these pieces, that we were seeing inequities in all of these systems. And COVID kind of unearthed many of those things. But I'm excited to pull out some of those 2020 declarations and policies and say, well, you remember when we declared this stuff, we didn't have many allies on the Republican side that would allow us to provide resources and funding and policies that mirrored the solutions. Now we can do that. And so that's going to be a conversation that I'll be leading at the state level, is when we said we need to address these things, we're in a position of power now. How are we going to do that in earnest? And a part of this Democratic trifecta's legacy has to be intentionally closing those gaps and creating systems that do just that. Otherwise, we have completely missed the mark.
That's a fair assessment. I was just like, wow, yes. So I apologize that I sort of zoned there for a minute. I was just like,
That's
yeah,
okay.
okay, preach. Um, so look, governing when you're in the majority is sometimes more difficult than it is in the minority. Making it more complicated for the current legislature is you've only got a +1 majority in the House and a +2 majority in the Senate. Are you going to be able to find senators and representatives to cross that aisle in light of all of the hostility that we've seen over the last? I mean, it's really dates back to Barack Obama's nomination as president, in terms of the real partisan gut wrenching. Are we going to see crossing the aisles and putting aside the rancor?
This is what I'll say. I was reviewing the bills that I've been able to, champion and get signed by the governor to make them public acts, and the amount of money that we've been able to secure for Mid-Michigan. I have always worked across the aisle very effectively in order to deliver for my constituents. Um, a lot of that just takes patience and skill and overly communicating, and quite honestly, finding pragmatic ways to bring people along. Most of the bills that are signed into law are, overwhelmingly supported by both sides of the aisle. And so I think that there's a time for campaigning and there's a time for governing. And the campaign has been over for a month or so now. And so now it's time for us to look at what's best for Michigan residents. And I've just built a strong reputation for doing that here in Mid-Michigan. So that won't go away. And I think that if I can be helpful in, level setting what those relationships might look like with our Republican friends who now find themselves in a different position than they've been in, at least for the Senate, my entire lifetime, what that could look like. And I do think that there's so much that we have in common. Every year, Todd, I reread The Audacity of Hope by Barack Obama. And it's all about picking the pieces that we have in common, right? Safety and religion and family and all of these pieces that we do have in common. It's just the route that we want to take to get there, and making sure we're not destroying each other in the process. So there's a way to do it. My legacy in the House is evidence that you can actually work together to do cool things.
Okay. So I guess one more question, and then I'll do my famous last question. This one is one that others have brought up actually in interviews. So I thought, heck, I'll throw it at you. Apparently, there were the votes to pass an amendment to Elliott Larson in both the House and the Senate last year, but leaders would not allow it to come to a vote. Now, we've had some judicial decisions that sort of amended Elliott Larson to include LGBTQ people in a different way. Are you prepared to lead the way to amend Elliott Larson so that it's absolutely crystal clear LGBTQ people are protected and covered under that law?
Well, I will say this. It's an exciting time in the legislature because, and I don't want to misspeak, but I think we have a record number of openly LGBTQ plus men and women in the House and the Senate. Representation absolutely matters in every single community. And so the fact that we have individuals who are coming in ready to lead that charge is really exciting. So for me, I'm ready to support and lead, but also take the leadership of that caucus to make sure that I'm being a supportive ally. But I'm ready. I cannot wait to take that historic vote. And I think it's going to be a really beautiful day in our state that finally so many individuals can fully enjoy the privileges of our state. And it's insane that it's taken this long. So I'm excited.
Okay. All right. So this is my big famous last question. And it is there anything that I didn't ask you about as it relates to this first year of Democratic control that you think is really important to add to our conversation?
Yeah.
Which is a deliberately big question.
It is a big question. It is a big question. I will say two things. The first is Michigan is so blessed right now. The fact that we have the type of lawmakers from our region that are also in some pretty key positions is historic. And I think that our charge is to not just look at, all the big issues that impact our state, but also be laser focused on the future of Mid-Michigan. If we leave this time with the governor living right around the corner from my house, Representative Whitwer on the west side, Sam Singh over in East Lansing. We have these powerful folks who are in this region right now who drive around the potholes that you mentioned, that see a downtown that is asleep after 5 o'clock. COVID has impacted the workforce in our community. It is the best of times with these big investments of, battery chips and all these things, but it's also the worst of times for the men and women who literally are trying to find warmth this winter. And so if we do not come together with some of the most powerful positions living within a stone's throw of the Capitol, we have missed the mark in a way that would be absolutely tragic. And then the other last big thing I will say is it's a historic time. The fact that my nieces, who are growing up in a time in which they can see the first Black Speaker of the House, they can see the first woman Senate Majority Leader, and their aunt is the first Black woman to chair appropriations in the Senate. It's not just about representation, but I think it's also about all of the different communities who have not had direct representation in these negotiations. It's a pretty special time. And so I think that folks should expect not just representation, but for us to deliver for the communities that we serve. So I'm just excited. I hope you can see how excited I am.
I actually can. And one question that came up to me as I was listening to you, and I would be remiss as a member of the Michigan Press Association to not ask you this, and that is, will you support expanding FOIA to include the legislature and the executive branch?
Yes, 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 yep. Transparency is important. It just is. It just
Okay.
is. So
And piggybacking on that, as you know, currently the Open Meetings Act explicitly excludes partisan caucuses of the state legislature. Would you revisit that to open caucuses up for public view as well, so that folks get a chance to see the sausage being made, if it were?
yeah, I mean, I would support that. And here's the thing. I think that people have an understanding that sometimes negotiations do require a little more nuance, right? I mean, I 100% think that that's something that even the public understands. But the more transparency we have in government, the better. And so I am supportive in concept.
Okay, great. Anything else before I turn off the recording?
It's always the hardest question to say anything else, but I just appreciate the opportunity to chat, and I hope that folks heard me on the campaign trail when I say that governance is about partnership. And so people were super fired up around the campaign trail. I need them to keep the same energy as we see in the next 4 to 8 years, what the state of Michigan starts to prioritize. Will need their voices at the table, just like the men and women that they elected.
Okay, fantastic. I'm going to turn off the recording, but thank you, State Representative and Senator-elect Sarah Anthony. By the time this runs, you will be Senator Sarah Anthony. So thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you.